like I said, I have picked a ton of spoopy cards for us to look at here in our Spooptober extravaganza. I'm going to start from the top here. Oh, Three of Swords coming up next. That's a fun one. Before I get ahead of myself there, I want to look at the fives. I pulled all 4 of the fives looking at spooky cards, because honestly, the 5 as a rank in where it falls in the progression is a rather conflicted stop on the journey in our, kind of narrative walk through the cycle of each of these suits. So they share that kind of commonality, and I was like, well, they're a great set to look at for some of our spooky cards. I find the Five of Swords a little less spooky than maybe some of these other ones. If I were to rank these in spookiness, I'd say the Cups hits me hardest, the Wands follow, Pentacles after that, and then I personally don't mind what happens and what you do in the Five of Swords. So I know for a lot of people it's more spooky and less comfortable than it is for me. We'll get to that in a moment. I want to start from the spoopiest. Look at this here, Five of Cups, which is a card that's kind of dark and drab. And I mean, look at this. Even in the traditional Rider-Waite, the sky is gray. There's a black cloaked figure here who's, kind of obsessed with 3 cups that have spilled over. This is a card that illustrates grief and loss better than any in the tarot deck. And this person is consumed with grief and loss. I should talk for a moment about how I like to interpret spooky cards. A lot of times these cards get kind of bundled into, oh, those are bad cards. Those are when bad things happen. And I've always shied away from applying good and bad and our value judgments to any of the tarot cards, because good and bad are value judgments, and they have to operate on some basis, some, preconception of what is valuable, what is good and bad, and that is subjective. Honestly, that is subjective. What is good and bad is subjective, and many times I believe that many will agree this is a hard, bad time, but there are times when going through grief and loss is a really necessary part of our growth. There are times when it is inevitable, and we gain a lot of strength from accepting and embracing it. It's always a mixed bag, so I don't like to just look at these cards and say they're bad cards. And I think, in fact, viewing them that way makes it harder for me to interpret them with a completely open mind, and really offer a meaningful definition of them that I think will help us move forward. Because if I'm calling them bad cards, I'm more just sitting here thinking, oh, this is bad. This is bad. Woe is me. I am sad. And then I'm not really super productive in my thoughts if I'm just sitting here engaging and enabling a downward spiral in my practice with tarot. So that's my caveat about, I don't like to say bad cards. I've said spooky cards. I like saying spooky. That's very fun. Spoopy, very fun. And challenging. Often challenging cards, I think, is fair to say, because our experience is often challenged in these scenarios. So here's the challenging moment of experiencing grief. It follows the Four of Cups, which is much later in my list of cards I want to look at. Where in the Four of Cups you were just really discontent with what you had, and you were so fixated on what you couldn't have that you actually lost and neglected what you did when you have arrived in the Five. So there's a lot of regret over, oh, how did this happen? Or how did I know how I contributed to this happening? And there's a common theme kind of in the Four of Cups and the Five of Cups in terms of a takeaway here. And I think it's very important when we're reading challenging cards to focus on, okay, what's my takeaway? What's the message I'm receiving that is helping me, that is empowering me, that is helping me make more informed and more powerful choices? Like, that's what's really most important to be drawing off these cards. So when I'm looking at the Five of Cups, it's the acknowledgement that, yes, I am experiencing deep grief. Very important to acknowledge our feelings, because they are the landscape from which we operate, from where we're coming from. And by ignoring or denying them, we're kind of holding ourselves at square one before we can even get through, what do we do about it? If I haven't even stepped into, I am sad. So there is a certain degree of all of these cards that I'm going to keep reiterating. Recognize the truth. A lot of times when we meet a challenging and uncomfortable card in the tarot, we are being prompted to recognize the truth that you know it's making you sad. Don't deny it. That's where the conversation starts. can't move on without first acknowledging that. So that's the first important thing I want to point at in the Five of Cups is, yes, the person is consumed with grief. No, that's not a bad thing. It just is where you're at. You got to start there. Now, in the Four of Cups, which I keep mentioning, let's see if I can find you in my list here. Come on out. You got a special feature, Four of Cups. Look at you. In the Four of Cups, there's the one cup that you're kind of wishing for and the three being neglected. Here are the three neglected cups now tipped over. The interesting thing in both of these cards is there are cups that are upright, that are fine, that are offering you some good stuff. The funny thing about feelings in an emotional experience, hi Nico, glad you made it. The funny thing about our emotional experience, right, is that it's kind of overwhelming and all-encompassing. When we are feeling grief, it feels as though there is nothing else in the world. Like, that's the only feeling we have. And so that's where it's illustrated this person's attention is 100% on those fallen cups, because the experience of that loss is all-consuming. It consumes all of our attention. Similarly, this person is just wishing for the fourth cup so much that their attention is completely off the other three. It's important to recognize in some of these cards the difference between our experience and reality. And the cups suit is just all about our emotional experiences, and they really speak to that and nothing more. It is illustrated here that while you're feeling nothing but loss, there is still something standing up. Your life is not completely lost. There is something to turn around and get back to, which is what you get to in the Six of Cups later when you reflect on what's still there and what you still have that feeds you and makes you feel good. So that's kind of the important takeaway here in the Five of Cups to me, is just recognizing that, yes, consumed with grief, and that's powerful, and that is all-consuming of your attention, but very important to recognize that while you're having that experience, there's some that's not lost. And oftentimes that's the medicine here in the Five of Cups that makes it a little easier to progress through into that six, is the recognition that even in the midst of my deepest grief, not all is lost. I tend to look for the helpful messages that help us move forward in our spooky cards, and that's the one that I see in the Five of Cups. I think it's going to be really important to illustrate, what's the empowering takeaway. And the empowering takeaway in our Five of Cups is not all is lost, even though it feels so. And it's okay that it feels that way. That's just the reality of how it feels. And there's also a reality that not all is lost. And to remember that all feelings are temporary. It'll pass. That feeling will pass, but the cups will stay. Those standing cups will still be there when you're done really just processing the grief. Five of Cups is this place where it's like, okay, it's time to accept and just be in my grief so I can let it flow out of me and move on to the next feeling, where I can, now that I've really accepted and experienced my grief, I can really look at those two cups feeling a lot more fresh and really appreciating them. I just experienced three cups tipped over so profoundly and so painfully, and that makes my appreciation of these ones standing so much greater. And it's really a lot of the ingredients in the five that set us up for that transition into the six. I set aside like 20 cards I wanted to get through, and I'm going to spend way too much time on these first four. Let's move on to the Five of Wands. This is often the conflict card. It's kind of called, there's a bunch of people fighting with wands, and it's kind of called the deadlock also. They're all kind of woven together and stuck. And this is kind of a moment in the cycle where you've been trying to achieve your ends and you've had some success, but these are the first barriers, roadblocks, first real challenges that you're presented that you have to overcome to continue your kind of initiative, your pursuit. This is our fire element. We're talking wands. This is all about our creative passions and our initiative and the stuff that we do for the sake of ourselves. This is, the element relating to the spirit. And these are our drives that come through us. When you get stuck against these walls, it can be a very challenging time, because now you're meeting a lot of people that are, introducing a lot of resistance to what you were trying to achieve. In the Five of Wands, there's usually a message of just don't give up, because when you're in the deadlock, you've made it this far, or halfway through the cycle, and you've got to keep pushing, because you don't want to give up and just let it all fall apart, let everyone crash down on top of you. You got to keep pushing. And the common theme that comes across a lot of the wands is this tenacity, and the dedication of time and will and energy and effort will eventually overcome any obstacle. And there's this dedication to that drive in the fire suit that comes up here in the Five of Wands. While we're meeting conflict, while we're meeting all these challenges and people's whose views or aims and intentions and objectives contradict and conflict with our own, we've got to really hold our ground and recognize that now is the time to assert ourselves more than ever, really, if we want to keep pushing through with what we've been trying to achieve. And this Five of Wands kind of illustrates a place, where truly you're operating from a place that's truly you, truly your passion, and you're trying to bring it into reality. There's a lot about the fire suit that can tread into a ground where it seems like you're being overbearing or domineering or brutish, just outright, just forcing yourself in this completely inconsiderate way on the world around you. And maybe the water suit or the air suit might say, yeah, that's what it's like, to the fire suit. But there's a reality to challenges that you will face that you will just simply need to overcome through your own dedication and force of will. Those are illustrated in the Five of Wands, which progresses to the Six, the victory card, where you have overcome the challenges presented in the Five. The lesson for me in terms of the empowerment that comes out of the Five of Wands, the recognition that even though you are facing challenges here in the Five of Wands, it's your chance to really push through and come out victorious if you can push hard enough. It's this message that says double down, get it, get at it, don't give up. Don't let those first roadblocks be the thing that makes you think this is too impractical or impossible. Fire doesn't care about practical. That's Earth's domain. Fire's like, I'm doing it. Why? Because I'm doing it. I don't need a reason. I'm fire. Fire's funny that way. Earth and air are so different, and water is fine if I feel like it is the reason. That's fine enough for water. Earth is such a practical, I need a real reason element. Air needs some sort of directive reason for what they're doing. I want to look at the Five of Pentacles because, time check, we're okay. I'm not going to get through all these cards, but we're okay. I'm going to get some spooky cards in. The Five of Pentacles is often called the pariah card, where you're kind of shut out. There's this illustration in the Rider-Waite of a church with lepers outside who are not even allowed in the church. This symbol of the most welcoming, all-encompassing sanctuary. These people are on the outside. They're not even allowed in. That's how much of a social outcast these people are. The Five of Pentacles. Now, I learned that I read this card pretty differently than maybe its standard or given definition, because a lot of times people will read this that it reflects also a loss of wealth or, just some sort of failure. I've always read it as being alone in a way. We're coming out of the Four of Pentacles, where we conserved ourselves and kept ourselves to ourselves so that we can really invest ourselves in what we're trying to develop into our own practice or into investments that we think will pay us out in the long term. I don't want to give everything away now. And the Five of Pentacles is kind of this resulting, well, now that I've not connected myself to anybody or really put myself in any place, I don't have any of those connections, and I'm biding my time alone and weathering this alone. It's a very solitary pursuit. And I see a lot of that in the Five of Pentacles. That said, it can be really hard to be shut out from everything because, there's no one that's seen the value that you possess because you haven't yet demonstrated or shown it too much. You haven't shared it too much. A lot of times the Five of Pentacles is a place where the message is just wait. Your time will come. It's not your time now. Challenging message. It's not your time now. But, whereas fire is going to solve all their problems by push harder, Earth is going to solve all their problems like patient space. I'll just wait for my chance. I love Earth. I have a lot of Earth in my personality. And this Five of Pentacles is a challenge of patience when things feel destitute or stuck. There's a lot of stuckness in all these fives. That's a common theme here. you know, when things are feeling that way, it's this real trial of patience in the Five of Pentacles to really stick to, even though I'm shut out and alone and feel like I have nothing and nobody, I can still weather this snowstorm, and with enough time, I'll get to the other end. And all those investments that I made earlier will start to pay me back. And that, you know, we arrive in the 6 where that's the case, and now we have a lot to share, and we do invest ourselves around us and build something up that eventually becomes our earthy, secure empire by the end of the end of the cycle. Patience pays. Oftentimes the message off of a lot of the pentacles to me. So that's how I'd point to this spooky scenario is, yeah, you're alone now, but just wait. Just wait. Weather the storm. Just wait. Hold yourself up. I'm going to glance at the Five of Swords, which I mentioned earlier. I don't mind this card that much. Other people do. This is the Pyrrhic Victory. There's the Swindler. Pictures someone who has just kind of conned these other two people in the background out of these 5 swords, kind of posed a shady deal, and got away with it. You know, but it's called Pyrrhic Victory or empty victory because a lot of times after having gained your gains, but they're ill-gotten, comes with mixed feelings. I got here, but what did it cost me in terms of my morals or my character? Got here, but what did it cost me in terms of the pitfalls and traps I've set up for myself with the lies I just laid out? It's that consideration that comes up in the Five of Swords. The Five of Swords is this interesting place where we're first really challenged to consider our morals in the sword suit. Before this in the sword suit, there's a lot about just, you know, making choices about the action that we do going forward, even when the choices are hard, and weathering that storm, getting through those challenges to this point where now we are situated in a place where we recognize, you know, I can get mine too. I can get my share. And I figured out a way how that's questionable. You know, I suppose this is the least stuck of these, and it progresses into the Six of Swords where we're now kind of questioning our morals and doing that introspective deep dive into what's the direction I do want for myself. Who am I? What am I about? What am I trying to get to? What am I trying to achieve? These are the questions that we begin asking ourselves in the Six of Swords. The first time that our very kind of masculine swords element becomes introspective. Takes all the way to the 6. Takes a little bit. Maybe you could argue some introspection in the Four of Swords, but I just see that more as a period of rest and no thought more than introspection. But this Five of Swords, right? It's a lot of people are very uncomfortable being in this position because they feel, you know, just the guilt or the anxiety of having ill-gotten gains. It's a weight to carry. It's a certain mental weight to carry. It can be really uncomfortable. So, you know, if you're not asking yourself the questions about who am I, you're going to be stuck here in the I'm just setting up more traps for myself by continuing to be a swindler, right? I'm just cheating my way through life. You can only fake it so far before it starts to fall apart. Those skeletons in the closet, you keep packing them away, eventually you run out of space. Yeah, so I have a fair amount of air in my personality alongside the earth. And I want to talk about air for a moment because we're gonna get into that suit. Oh, there are a lot of spooky sword cards. So I want to talk about spooky sword cards. The air element is just our intellectual element. It's very important to recognize that there's a separation of head and heart in the tarot. You know, the mind and heart operate in different realms, and those are separated and represented in our cups and our swords, you know, and they are separate. So when we're talking about our swords element, these are things referring to just our intellectual process, and a lot of the resultant feelings that come out of the scenarios depicted in the swords can vary depending on the person experiencing them. And I think that people with more air in their personality that are able to operate in this strictly intellectual way are able to kind of disconnect, be objective, and let's go. This is the action that we must take, and I am air, so I am ready to just dive in. Anyway, the air element is, interestingly, I think, kind of unbothered by emotional aspects that we experience. And that is how I think, now, I'm going to say that because there are many cards in the air element that qualify for very spoopy, and it stands out that way. The suit stands out that way, and many beginning or intermediate readers will notice this right away. Why is the sword suit so hard to go through, man? So many uncomfortable places on that trip in that cycle. And to me, when you're operating in a strictly intellectual context, it really frames a lot of these situations very differently. But we are full, complete human creatures here that do have an emotional experience of all these different places, so it's important to acknowledge. Although a lot of times ruminating on our feelings are not how we move the sword's suit along. They demand action. There's always something to do with the sword suit. I'm going to start from the top here with the Three of Swords. Look at that. The Heartbreak card. Swords straight on through. That is something there. That rainy, stormy, like oftentimes these features find themselves in this card. This resembles, in the Two of Swords, which I think I pulled. Yeah, I pulled the Two of Swords. In the Two of Swords, we have to make a really difficult choice, usually between bad and worse. And it's very, difficult to evaluate in that kind of situation. But the swords element is very good at doing that, because since we're operating in a strictly intellectual kind of way and being disconnected from our feelings, it's a little easier to just sum up the pros and cons and be like, okay, I choose bad instead of worse. But when you're between bad and worse, you eventually arrive at the Three, which sums up the feeling of regret over your previous actions very well. I think better than covering the tarot. This is inevitably going to happen between bad or worse. And it's kind of a step that you just have to take. When you have to make a hard choice, you also have to experience its consequences and feel those. This can be a really tumultuous and challenging time. That is illustrated in the Three of Swords. The intellectual experience of the Three of Swords, is mostly just did what had to be done. It's rough. I see the damage, but, I'm playing damage control, and there's nothing to do about it now. Nothing to do about it now but get over it and move on. This takes us into our Four, where we have this respite, this period of rest of I'm not taking action or thinking about anything now. The damage is done. The repair work is happening. It's just got to let it ride and get through this. Is a lot of what keeps the Three of Swords moving forward. Very easy for us to get stuck in the scary, oh my gosh, I feel bad. Oh my gosh, things are so sad in the Three of Swords, and just be stuck there. I think it's important to recognize the moving forward happens when we're really focusing on that happened. I just have to accept it and move on. Just let it go. Get over it. It already happened. It's done. It's yesterday's news. I'm done with it. Yeah, it was rough. Yeah. Oh well. Air is so good at that. Air is so good at that. Thoughts, I will say, are lightning fast. Much faster than feelings and how they change. Feelings are sticky, and they do change, and they are temporary, and they do pass, but it takes them some time. And, we experience them for a while. Thoughts are just like, I'm putting A and B together and I'm now at C and we're done. And we're moving forward. Like, there is so little time and they move so quickly that something like this to the swords is like, well, I did A and B and I chose C and it resulted in devastation, and that's fine. I knew that was coming and I'm on to the next. What's next? Air is so good at what's next. Now let's get into the 8, 9, 10 of the air suit, which I think are some of the spookier cards that we'll be covering. These are definitely challenging situations. These qualify as spooky as can be, but not bad. I gave my spiel on really not liking bad, and I'm going to work really hard to not affix that word to any of these cards, other than mentioning it to say, don't do it. I'm looking at this Eight of Swords. This is a feeling of being trapped. Oftentimes this late in the cycle, there are many, kind of extenuating factors that are limiting what you can do in the situation. And there is this feeling of being stuck, like there's nothing left that you can do in this situation. There's a certain reality in the Eight of Swords that the path right ahead of this person is clear, but they're blindfolded. So there's no awareness of that. You know, the situation is also confusing. You don't have all the information. You just know you're tied to one sword and you can only lean left and right from there, and you feel swords on the other side and you're like, okay, whatever, there's nothing to do, I'm stuck. It's kind of the feeling in the Eight of Swords. It's kind of important to recognize from the Eight of Swords where there are still moving pieces in the equation to help yourself move forward. And again, you know, the stifling experience of the Eight of Swords, or just seeing that card come up in a reading when you were hoping for progress or hoping for something great, can be really hard to recognize, to stomach the pill of, oh my gosh, there's just very little for me to do now. My optimistic read on the Eight of Swords is the message it provides is not yet. There is no opportunity here. So you got to bide your time in a way. You know, you just got to wait for your opportunity to open, or think creatively to you know, find that option you hadn't considered previously because you're operating on your preconception of the way things have gone up until this point. You know, that's the hidden here path right in front of the person you're trying to find. It's important to, when you're feeling that stifled and like there's nothing you can do about a situation, to recognize, okay, maybe there's nothing I can do right now. And that's fine. I'll just have to work with that. Now, while you're stuck there, you move into our Nine of Swords, which captures the feeling of anxiety better than I think any card in the deck. I keep saying that about these cards. This is the anxiety card. While you're stuck with very little to do, it often, since what you are aware of are the limitations in the way that things can fall apart around you, you're stuck between these, you know, very imposing swords, you're going to be stuck on worrying about all the bad things that can happen, how this is going to fall apart. And the anxiety card here is when our thoughts are just spinning out and playing all sorts of just what if kind of hypothetical scenarios. All those, what are all these ways that things can go wrong for me, kind of thought patterns. This card illustrates that downward spiral of thought, the kind of thoughts that literally keep us awake at night, are captured here in the Nine of Swords. There's, again, looking at our sword suit, this represents our mental kind of process. There is going to be probably a pairing emotional experience to this, and for most, but maybe not all, the feeling of anxiety can be, you know, kind of tense and uncomfortable and worrisome and anxious. And, you know, these feelings are not the most comfortable to go through. Your thoughts are kind of stuck in certain patterns here in the Nine of Swords. And it's important to recognize that anxiety is kind of guiding your thoughts a lot. And there's the interesting way that, of course, if that's where our focus is, that's what will bring to us and what will actually manifest. So there is that concern. But there's also the message here in the Nine of Swords that oftentimes we're not acknowledging where things are okay, because that's just not where our thoughts are focused. You know, remembering that, you know, our sword suit is not necessarily illustrating strict reality, but just how we think about it. So if we're just spending all our time worrying, then sure, we're just going to feel worried. But this doesn't mean that everything necessarily needs to be worrying. Just that there are many things that are worrying and that are worrying you right now. And that's important to recognize because going forward, they're going to have to be acknowledged and grappled with. You know, there's that, you know, impending sense of doom. And the Nine of Swords are just worried that everything's about to fall apart, which puts me very cleanly into our Ten of Swords, which is the everything is falling apart card. Here is someone pierced by 10 swords just laying dead under a murky black sky. One of the more imposing, most spooky cards we're going to cover today. Ten of Swords is all about just this experience of this is the worst thing that could have absolutely happened. This is the worst. Everything that I was worried about in the 9, really many of those things happened in the 10 because our worries are not necessarily unfounded. You know, we're recognizing that mistakes I made in the 5 that I kind of recognized in the 6 that I kind of kept to myself in the 7, and then started to recognize the real confining or, you know, limiting factors and concerning factors of in the 8. Now I'm worrying about in the 9 and arriving in the 10 where some of those consequences are maybe manifesting in ways that reaffirm my thoughts and belief that everything's going terribly and this is all wrong. Again, not necessarily reflective of strict reality. Maybe rooted in some real things, but often our thoughts are more dramatic and kind of a little clouded and not as informed as what reality actually is. And a lot of books you'll see will kind of add that caveat to the Ten of Swords that this is the experience of all is lost. This is the experience of I've bottomed out, I'm at rock bottom, not necessarily the reality of being there. Important to recognize when this card turns up for you to really evaluate, like, am I just making a little bit of hyperbole about how bad my situation is? Is that what's being kind of signaled to me in this card? Or, and a lot of times I love to bring this aspect of the card forward, when you've hit rock bottom, there's nowhere to go but up. Coming out of the Ten of Swords, it's like, okay, those bad things I was worried about happened, and then Swords does its thing that I love. What now? And moves forward from that, and there's only up to go from here, and we move into this Ace of Swords where I've now got a new frame of mind that I'm approaching the same thing with, because I've learned so much from the previous cycle. I've made my missteps, and I'm learning from those mistakes. What now? I move forward with a new Ace of Swords kind of way to do things. And that's where the Ten of Swords is moving to. It's very important. I'm going to keep reiterating, when we're looking at spooky cards that are getting us feeling down in a reading, we've got to ask ourselves, where does this prompt growth? Where does this show me how it moves forward? That's what I'm being counseled to do here. And the Ten of Swords, it's like, yeah, you feel awful. You feel like everything that could have gone wrong did. You've hit rock bottom, right? What now? Time to go up. Pick yourself up and make what you can from there. And, the swords are mental suit that can be lightning quick from all these different mental spaces, can flip from the Ten of Swords pretty quickly into an Ace of Swords. Our feelings, of course, like I said, will be a little slower to follow. Managing our feelings while navigating the swords suit can be one of the greater challenges that suit presents. And that will be more or less challenging for people depending how much of air and water characteristics are really present in them. So that's the caveat that I like to add in terms of, how are these cards landing for each person, the different clients that you might see, or yourself, if you're reading for yourself, to understand and know yourself and what these spaces are like for you. Can help you understand a lot of the emotional challenges that might come up alongside the challenge of guiding your thoughts or spinning out in your thoughts. Important to know the whole picture for yourself, all the challenges you'll face. Even with our little power outage, we are doing all right on time. So I'm going to keep going and do another set of spooky cards. I really want to touch on the major Arcana cards that are kind of spooky. So that's going to be really fun. This may be the last set that I get through today. We'll see. Honestly, the cards that I had beyond this were kind of honorable mentions. They're a lot less spooky, so I'm happy that I at least got through my really spooky ones. Trying to hit all my bases, all the cards that are really scary to encounter in a reading, and how to kind of stomach them. Here's the major Arcana cards that I picked out as my favorite spookies. I'm looking at Death. I have talked about these a little bit when I reviewed the major Arcana, but I'm going to view them in a slightly different lens now. Death is this kind of symbol of ultimate inevitable ending of things. Just everything has a time and everything eventually ends. And death reflects that. Death reflects that moment where there is a terminal place for so many old things, which, death serves a purpose to make space for new things to grow out of that. I love the analogy of when you're gardening. You prune the dead leaves and stems so that the rest can grow healthy. It's very necessary to let go of the parts that are wilted and dying, and so that we can move forward. And death is usually featured carrying a banner with like a rose, something prominent that's blossoming and blooming, to represent that new life that death ushers in its wake. So death can be a scary card, especially the name, Death, and especially the threat of things ending can be really scary, especially if the things that we're kind of attached to or fond of. But a lot of times it reflects things that needed to go, really needed to go. And oftentimes in our objective to move forward through death is just to recognize that those things did need to go, or accept that everything has a time and eventually does go. And the time, the time now is ripe and ready for us to recognize what grows forth from this. What can I make of this? What's left? And, those things will suddenly show you the deeper treasures you have to discover, in where you are now. This is about midway in the cycle with the major arcana. So there's a lot that you've built up before this, and a lot yet to come. We're only about halfway. So that's kind of a part of the picture here too. Death is a transition, not an end. It is very terminal for many things, but more than that, it's a transition. Which is interesting. There's a lot of aspects of death that I think its definition kind of subvert what the word death brings up for us when we first see it. So I think that understanding kind of the fuller picture of what death means makes it a lot less spooky, honestly. It feels less spooky to me when I consider its full picture. But it is. If there are many times in a reading that this card could come up and be threatening and menacing, depending on its position and context. If it wasn't something that you wanted to be introduced to death, it's going to be really uncomfortable to see. And death is inevitable. I said that before. That's important to recognize. You can't wrestle with death. It just happens. Death forces you into a position where it's like you either accept it or you don't, and you lay down and just stay there clinging on to the dead bits until you're done, and you get up and get with the program and keep moving forward. So there's a lot of that can bring a lot of challenges with it in death, in terms of if we have emotional attachments or reasons that we were invested in things that we didn't want to let go of. Death can bring some amount of loss, and through its transition, that can be challenging, depending on how this card appears to you. Spooky, spooky death. Hey, we got a skeleton. Happy Spooktober, everybody. The next one in the Major Arcana that I wanted to look at that gets a lot of highlights as a challenging card is the Devil. I've spoken to the Devil actually a lot on the shuffle. It's the third time I think that I'm coming back to this card. It's come up in a couple readings. And the Devil often works by planting ideas in you that, like, this is what you want to do. This is what's valuable to you. But gets you attached to things that pretty much are just in the Devil's domain that you can never truly have, or that will never truly satisfy you in a way. So you kind of hold yourself back by immersing yourself in the pleasures the Devil provides. So in terms of this card coming up, it does kind of caution you and prompt you to really think about what is valuable to you and what really serves you in the end. This late in the cycle, 15th card in the Major Arcana cycle, we're in a position where we're now able to recognize what does and doesn't serve us, regardless of how we feel or think about them. It's clear to us this far in the cycle that, those are the parts that, like, death was pulling and that, like, aren't helping me manage things in temperance. It's very clear. The Devil is now thrown into daylight. Stark, clear daylight. Once you've arrived at the card, the Devil, it's kind of clear. You know what the Devil represents. You know what of your behaviors and what of your habits and what of your life the Devil really has been offering you that you have kind of wed yourself to. So that's kind of part of the message here too, is that the Devil is not necessarily super mysterious. At this point in the cycle, it is clear. In terms of moving on from the Devil, it's very challenging because the whole point is that the things that you are attached to, you've been attached to for a long time. You kind of built into, this is my character, this is who I am, this is what I'm about, right? And now I'm suddenly recognizing it doesn't serve me. So that's really hard to recognize. Really hard. Even harder still to move on from. Try and let go of those things. We're kind of prompted to in the Tower. I'm going to transition into that card. I sure hope Wilder is here because I always think of them when this card comes up, because it came up so many times between us during the time that we shared together in Ukiah, and I know it's a card that they're fond of too. So I love the quote that we actually share a sort of fondness for the tower, and I'll explain why in a moment. But first I want to illustrate its spookiness. The tower resembles sudden and drastic, unanticipated ruin. Kind of when we became aware of those things that weren't serving us in the devil, the tower is the moment that it becomes starkly clear how and why they weren't serving us, and those aspects of ourselves that were set up to bring us ruin. I like there's usually a bolt of lightning coming out of the sky that's striking the tower, and essentially I see this as a moment that our tower that we've built up, everything that we built up in ourselves and for the situation around us up to this point, 16 cards through a 22 card major arcana cycle. We're late in the cycle, right? There's a lot at stake. Is being challenged. Suddenly the bolt of lightning comes out of the sky and it's like, where's your tower ready? Were you built strong enough to withstand this? And the answer is, nope. Flaws exposed. Boom. What I had made mistakes wedding myself to and the devil are now structural flaws in the base of my tower and a lack of anticipation for those elements that came at me from the bolt of lightning in the tower. So everything is crumbling and falling down. I haven't done much to illustrate why I like this card yet. We'll get there. A lot of what's kind of, communicated to us when the tower appears is a note of caution that we're about to have our worldview abruptly challenged and changed, and that we kind of need to be ready for that. The tower requires a lot of open-mindedness to navigate the experience of, because you've got to recognize the flaws you made in the base of that tower, the flaws that you had in your conceptions of the way things should work, the way things should serve you. You have to recognize those. But there's this interesting moment standing in the rubble of the tower after it's all come down, where it is so starkly clear. The things that we recognize, like, oh, those were the devil's things. Now it's like, oh, it's all fallen apart because of those things. Ooh. Now it is just like so clear what things were fundamentally flawed in the tower's design, in the design that we implemented for, our life and the scenario that this card might pertain to. And now you have to find a new direction. It moves you into the star, where you orient to a new direction that you can move forward and recognize the things you need to let go of to go that way. In the tower, we're having the moment of awakening. It's a bit of a rude awakening, but it is an awakening. It is a very insightful moment. It is definitely lessons learned, definitely one of the harder ways, but it is lessons learned. This is what I appreciate in the tower. And there's so much of the work that I've done with tarot that's all about really investigating my life and where I can learn lessons and further my growth. There are times that I have seen tower and just been like, yes, accelerate me. Just rush me through all of these lessons. Take me down to the lowest places and up to the top again. I just want to know what those depths and what those peaks can communicate to me. I want to be there. So there's a certain part of me that is just eager to take on the challenges the tower presents, because I love the reward and the return from knowing how to better build the tower after, from arriving in the star and finding a new direction for myself, a better direction for myself that serves me and my purpose more, which comes out of the tower. Reasons I like this card. But super spooky. Definitely not a comfortable position to have to accept, catastrophic sort of circumstances coming your way. Oh man. How's my time check? 5:58. Okay, cool. I'm going to do a couple minutes to tell a story of a tower that I drew for myself. There was a time that I woke up in the morning and for some reason had a curious, just intuitive hit that I needed to give myself a reading for that day. Couldn't have told you why, but I was glad that I did. And when I did, I sat down, and the big message to take away was just to prepare myself for a tower that day, that it was really happening. And I was just like, okay. And I just felt this stirring feeling that it was unshakably true, and I was like, okay. Deep breath, open mind, let's take the day as it comes. I walked to my job and was met by my boss at the door that was like, how did you know to come into work today? And I was like, oh, one of my coworkers mentioned because I was going to work on this project with them today. And he let me know that you can't come back here. And he had fired me for a variety of reasons that I won't get into here. But I got there at the front door of that job that day and was turned away and went home. And I chuckled to myself when I did. I was just like, oh, how fitting. There it is. There's the missteps I made there at that job. And I'm now walking home empty-handed. And definitely shocked and surprised. I was not expecting that to happen that day. But in an interesting way, drawing the tower previously had kind of prepped me for that moment. It really set me in a place where I was ready to receive it. I had the open mind going in. I was like, okay, challenge me today, world, let's go. And I just smiled and took it and moved on. I definitely felt like I was in a stronger and more empowered place to handle that situation when it came, for having been prepped by that card draw earlier. I definitely set myself in the place ready to accept it. Those are what I think are the spookiest cards in the tarot deck.